The blood-red sunset had barely kissed the Montana horizon when Rose Fairchild's horse collapsed beneath her, sending her tumbling to the hard, packed earth with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. Lying dazed in the dirt, her chestnut hair fanned out around her, Rose could only think of the irony she'd survived the 3-day ride from Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory, only to be stranded just miles from her destination of Copper Creek, Montana. "Easy there, Willow," Rose murmured, carefully rising to her knees beside the exhausted mare. The horse's sides heaved with labored breath, foam flecking her dark coat. Rose ran gentle hands over the animal's legs, finding no breaks but noticing the animal's obvious distress. "You've carried me far enough, old girl." The vastness of the Montana landscape suddenly felt oppressive. The nearest homestead could be miles away, and with night approaching and the temperature dropping, Rose knew she faced a dangerous situation. At 22, she'd been on her own long enough to recognize when trouble was brewing. A quick inspection revealed more problems. Her saddle had cracked along the cantle when Willow fell, making it impossible to continue riding even if her horse recovered. Rose sank back on her heels, the weight of her situation settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. The letter from her aunt in Copper Creek had promised a fresh start after the death of Rose's parents, but now she wondered if she'd ever reach that promised sanctuary. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her reach for the small derringer tucked in her boot, a necessary precaution for a woman traveling alone in 1876. The territory might be settling, but danger still lurked in many forms. A lone rider appeared on the crest of the hill, silhouetted against the deepening purple sky. Rose stood, keeping one hand on Willow's neck and the other near her hidden weapon. As the rider approached, she could make out a broad-shouldered man atop a sturdy buckskin horse. His dark Stetson was pulled low, obscuring his features until he drew close enough for her to see a strong jawline shadowed with stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Evening, miss," he called, his voice carrying across the distance between them. He reined his horse to a stop several yards away, a courteous distance that put Rose somewhat at ease. "Looks like you've got yourself some trouble." "My horse is done in," Rose replied, lifting her chin, "and my saddle's broken." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Name's Preston Nash," he said, approaching slowly. "I've got a small place about 3 miles east of here. Might be I can help." Rose studied him carefully. His clothes were worn but clean denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. The gun at his hip appeared to be there out of necessity rather than bravado. "Rose Fairchild," she offered cautiously. "Headed to Copper Creek to my aunt's place." Preston nodded, his gaze shifting to her horse. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Willow. At Rose's nod, he knelt beside the mare, running experienced hands over her legs and checking her breathing. "She's exhausted, but I don't see anything broken." "Good horse you've got here, just pushed too hard." "I had little choice," Rose said defensively. "The stage was robbed near Las Vegas. I had to make my own way from there." Preston's eyebrows rose, but he made no comment on her circumstances. Instead, he moved to examine her cracked saddle. "This can be mended," he said after a moment, "but it'll take time and proper tools." The last light was fading rapidly now, and Rose shivered involuntarily. She had few options and knew it. Preston must have noticed her dilemma. He stood and dusted off his hands. "Miss Fairchild, I can offer you shelter for the night. Your horse needs rest, and I've got the tools to fix that saddle. First light tomorrow, I can guide you to Copper Creek." Rose hesitated, weighing the risks of trusting this stranger against the certain danger of spending a night alone on the open range. "How do I know I can trust you, Mr. Nash?" A small smile touched his lips. He gestured toward Willow, then to the broken saddle. "A man who'd mean you harm wouldn't waste time fixing your horse or your gear, Miss Fairchild." As if to emphasize his point, he turned and began gently coaxing Willow to her feet, speaking in low, soothing tones. When the mare stood shakily, he carefully removed the broken saddle. "Trust me," Preston said quietly, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers. "I'll see you safely to your aunt's door." Something in his steady gaze convinced Rose. With a nod, she gathered her saddlebags while Preston secured her saddle to his horse. He offered his hand to help her mount behind him, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted, settling awkwardly behind him on his buckskin's broad back. With Willow's reins in hand, Preston turned his horse toward home. "It's not much," he warned over his shoulder, "but it's dry and warm." As they rode through the gathering darkness, Rose found herself studying the strong line of Preston's shoulders, the confident way he sat a horse, and wondered what twist of fate had placed him in her path, just when she needed help most. Preston's not much turned out to be a sturdy log cabin nestled in a small valley beside a creek. A corral stood nearby, and a weathered barn loomed dark against the night sky. As they approached, a dog's bark broke the silence, followed by the appearance of a large black and white border collie who greeted Preston with enthusiastic leaps. "That's Scout," Preston explained as he dismounted and reached up to help Rose down. "He's friendly, just noisy." Rose's legs felt stiff and sore as she slid to the ground, and she stumbled slightly. Preston's hand steadied her for a moment before he politely stepped back. "Let me get your horse settled first," he said, leading both animals toward the barn. "Make yourself at home. Door's not locked." Rose hesitated, then picked up her saddlebags and approached the cabin. The interior was surprisingly neat, illuminated by the silver light of the rising moon through the windows. She found a lamp on a table and, after some fumbling, managed to light it. The single room was simply furnished but comfortable, a cast iron stove in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf surprisingly well stocked, and a bed built into the far wall. A bearskin rug covered part of the wooden floor, and various tools hung from pegs on the walls. It was the home of a man who lived simply but not carelessly. Rose was still standing in the middle of the room when Preston returned, stamping his boots outside before entering. "Willow's resting comfortably with some good feed and water," he reported. "She should be right as rain by morning." "Thank you," Rose said, suddenly aware of how awkward their situation was, a single woman alone in a cabin with a man she'd just met. As if reading her thoughts, Preston gestured to a trunk at the foot of the bed. "There are blankets in there. I'll sleep in the barn. You can bar the door from inside if it makes you more comfortable." The straightforward offer surprised her. "I can't put you out of your own bed, Mr. Nash." "Preston," he corrected. "And it's no trouble. Been sleeping outdoors most of my life." He moved to the stove and stirred the banked coals before adding wood. "Are you hungry? I've got some stew I can heat up." Rose realized she hadn't eaten since morning. "That would be welcome, thank you." As Preston busied himself with the stove and a pot of stew that had been kept cool in a stone crock, Rose took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived through physical labor. His hands were calloused but deft as they worked, and she noticed a long scar that ran from his right wrist up under his rolled-up sleeve. "How long have you been in Montana?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Going on 5 years now," he answered without looking up. "Came up from Texas after the war." "The war?" Rose asked, puzzled by his age. He couldn't be much older than 30, a shadow crossed his face. I was young, lied about my age to join up. Confederate side, though I won't say I believed in the cause, just seemed like what men did. Rose nodded, understanding. Many young men had been caught up in that terrible conflict, some hardly more than boys. And now you ranch, small scale, Preston said, ladling stew into 2 tin bowls. Breed and train horses mostly. Do some hunting and trapping in winter, it's enough. He set a bowl before her along with a spoon and a chunk of bread. The stew was simple but surprisingly good venison with potatoes, carrots, and herbs she couldn't identify. "This is delicious," she said after a few bites. Preston smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Thank you. A man who lives alone either learns to cook or starves, and you've never—" Rose began, then stopped herself. "Forgive me, that's far too personal a question. Been married?" Preston finished for her, seeming untroubled by the inquiry. "No, came close once, back in Texas. But she wasn't keen on Montana winters, and I wasn't keen on staying in Texas." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of spoons against tin and the occasional pop from the stove. When they finished, Preston took the bowls to a wash basin while Rose suppressed a yawn. "You should rest," he said, noticing her fatigue. "I'll look at that saddle first thing tomorrow." "I truly appreciate your help," Rose said. "Not many would stop for a stranger." Preston paused by the door. "My father taught me never to pass by someone in trouble. Out here, that's a lesson that keeps people alive." He reached for his hat. "Good night, Miss Fairchild." "Rose," she corrected softly. "And good night, Preston." After he left, Rose barred the door, though she found she wasn't actually afraid. There was something trustworthy about Preston Nash that she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence he exuded, or the way he'd treated her with respect but not excessive formality. She changed into her nightdress behind a screen she found folded in the corner, then slipped into the surprisingly comfortable bed. The sheets smelled of soap and fresh air, and despite the strange surroundings, exhaustion quickly pulled her toward sleep. Her last waking thought was that perhaps fate hadn't been so cruel after all, placing her in the path of the quiet horseman with the storm-gray eyes. Rose woke to the rich aroma of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's eastern window, painting golden patterns across the floor. For a moment she was disoriented, then memory rushed back, her horse collapsing, the broken saddle, the kind stranger. Preston stood at the stove, his back to her, tending to something in a cast iron skillet. He'd obviously been up for some time, his hair was damp and he'd changed into a fresh shirt. The domestic scene struck Rose as oddly intimate. "Good morning," she said, sitting up while keeping the blanket pulled modestly around her. Preston turned, a spatula in hand. "Morning. Hope you slept well. I've got coffee ready and some breakfast coming along." "You didn't need to cook for me," Rose said, though the smell made her stomach rumble appreciatively. He shrugged. "Needed to eat myself. Might as well make enough for 2. He gestured toward a folding screen in the corner. "Put that up so you could have some privacy to dress. I'll step outside while you get ready." True to his word, Preston took his coffee cup and went out, closing the door behind him. Rose dressed quickly in her travel-worn riding skirt and blouse, wishing she had something fresher to wear. She'd packed her good dresses in her trunk, which had been on the stage when it was robbed. All she had left were the clothes in her saddlebags. When Preston returned, he brought a basin of fresh water for her to wash with. "Your horse is looking much better this morning," he reported. "I've given her feed and water. I've also taken a look at your saddle. The damage isn't as bad as it looked last night. I can mend it properly, but it'll take a few hours." I don't want to impose on your kindness any longer than necessary, Rose said, drying her hands on the towel he'd provided. It's no imposition, Preston assured her, serving up a breakfast of fried potatoes with onions and strips of salt pork. Truth is, I don't get much company out here. It's pleasant to have someone to talk to. Over breakfast, Rose found herself sharing more of her story. She told Preston about losing her parents to influenza the previous winter, about discovering her mother had a sister living in Montana whom Rose had never met. Aunt Harriet's letter said she has a boarding house in Copper Creek and offered me a place to stay and work, Rose explained. After the funeral expenses, there wasn't much left of Father's savings. The farm had to be sold to pay his debts. That's hard, Preston said quietly, losing family and home at once. Something in his tone made Rose look up from her coffee. You sound like you understand. A shadow passed over his face. Lost my parents and brother in a house fire when I was 16. Was out checking fence lines when it happened. Came back to nothing but ashes. I'm so sorry, Rose said, instinctively reaching across the table to touch his hand. Preston looked surprised at the contact but didn't pull away. It was a long time ago, he said, though his eyes suggested the pain hadn't diminished much with time. After a moment, he gently withdrew his hand and stood, collecting their plates. I should get to work on that saddle if we want to reach Copper Creek by afternoon. Outside, the day had bloomed into perfect late spring splendor. The creek that gave Preston's small ranch its water burbled cheerfully, and wildflowers dotted the surrounding meadow. Rose found Willow in the corral, looking remarkably recovered, her dark coat gleaming in the sunshine. Preston had set up a workbench outside the barn where he could take advantage of the good light. Rose's saddle sat before him as he examined the crack that ran along the cantle. Would you like me to help? Rose offered, approaching the workbench. Preston looked up, momentarily surprised by the offer. You know leather work. My father raised horses, Rose explained. I helped with repairs more times than I can count. I'm handy with an awl and sinew. A smile spread across Preston's face, transforming his serious features. Well then, I'd welcome the assistance. 2 pairs of hands will make quicker work of it. For the next several hours they worked together in companionable focus. Preston had the tools and materials needed: leather pieces, sinew thread, glue made from boiled hooves, and brass tacks to reinforce the repair. Rose's nimble fingers proved adept at the finer stitching, while Preston handled the structural reinforcement. As they worked, conversation flowed more easily between them. Preston told her about his small horse breeding operation, how he'd started with just 2 mares, and a stallion he'd brought up from Texas. Rose shared stories of her childhood on her father's farm in the New Mexico territory, where they'd raised horses and cattle. You know horses well, Preston observed as she expertly worked a piece of leather. I've been riding since I could walk, Rose replied. Father said I took to the saddle before I mastered walking properly. Preston laughed, a warm sound that Rose found she enjoyed. I believe it. You handled Willow's collapse yesterday with more calm than most men would show. The mention of the previous day's events sobered Rose. If you hadn't come along. But I did, Preston said simply. No use dwelling on what might have been. By midday, the saddle was repaired, the crack sealed and reinforced so thoroughly it seemed stronger than before. Preston tested it by applying his weight, then nodded in satisfaction. Good as new, he declared. Maybe better. Rose ran her hand over their handiwork, admiring the neat stitching. We make a good team, Mr. Nash. Preston, he reminded her, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. And yes, we do. The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the air. Rose felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze and turned away first, pretending to check Willow in the corral. "How far is Copper Creek from here?" she asked, changing the subject. "About 3 hours' ride," Preston answered, beginning to pack away his tools. "We should get some food in us before heading out. I'll make sandwiches we can take along." Back in the cabin, Preston assembled simple but hearty sandwiches of bread, cold salt pork, and the last of a wheel of cheese. Rose found herself studying the small homestead with new appreciation, the solid construction of the cabin, the well-organized tools and supplies, the small garden plot she'd noticed behind the house. "You've built a good life here," she observed as he wrapped the sandwiches in cloth. Preston glanced around as if seeing his home through her eyes. "It's simple, but it suits me." "Do you ever get lonely?" The question slipped out before Rose could stop it. Preston paused, considering her question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Winter evenings get long. But I've got Scout for company, and I make it to town every few weeks for supplies and human conversation." "Still," Rose said, "it's a solitary existence." "Most days I prefer it that way," he replied, but something in his tone suggested that wasn't always true. "Been on my own since I was 16. Got used to the quiet." As they prepared to leave, Rose gathered her few belongings while Preston saddled the horses. Willow seemed fully recovered, prancing a bit when Rose approached with the mended saddle. "She's ready for the trail," Preston said approvingly as he helped Rose secure her saddlebags. "Just take it easy on her for the first few miles." They set out just past noon, the spring sun warm on their backs as they rode side by side across the rolling landscape. Scout accompanied them partway, then returned to guard the homestead at Preston's command. The Montana countryside unfolded before them in breathtaking vistas, wide valleys carpeted with spring grass and wildflowers, stands of pine and aspen on the hillsides, and in the distance, the blue shadows of mountains. Streams and small rivers crisscrossed their path, forcing occasional detours to find safe crossings. As they rode, Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area. He knew the land intimately, where to find the best fishing holes, which valleys held the sweetest grass for grazing, how to read the clouds to predict weather changes. "See that ridge," he said, gesturing toward a distinctive formation to the north. "The Blackfoot believe it's the sleeping form of a great warrior who watches over these lands. They say when the ridge crumbles, he'll wake and walk again." "You know the Indian legends?" Rose asked, surprised. Preston nodded. "Made friends with a Blackfoot hunter my first winter here. He taught me a lot about surviving in this country. Their people understood this land long before we came blundering in." The respectful way he spoke of the native people impressed Rose. So many settlers viewed Indians with fear or contempt, but Preston seemed to recognize their wisdom and rightful connection to the land. They stopped by a clear stream to rest the horses and eat the sandwiches Preston had prepared. Sitting on sun-warmed rocks with the sound of rushing water beside them, Rose felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths. "What will you do in Copper Creek?" Preston asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Rose considered the question. "Help my aunt with her boarding house, I suppose. Perhaps find other work if needed. I'm a fair seamstress and I've taught children before." "You're educated then," my mother insisted, Rose replied. "She was a schoolteacher before she married father. She taught me literature, mathematics, history. Said a woman should be able to make her way in the world with her mind, not just her hands." "Wise woman," Preston commented. "Too many folks out here can barely read their own names." "And you?" Rose asked. "You seem well-read yourself." "I noticed books in your cabin." A faint flush colored Preston's cheeks. "My mother's influence, like yours. She was determined her sons wouldn't grow up ignorant even on a Texas ranch. Reading passes the winter nights. As they continued their journey, the terrain gradually changed, becoming more populated with small homesteads and fenced fields. They passed occasional travelers on the road, a wagon loaded with supplies, a pair of cowboys driving cattle, a male rider who tipped his hat to Rose. "We're getting close," Preston said as they crested a hill in the late afternoon. Below them, nestled in a broad valley where two rivers joined, lay the town of Copper Creek. From their vantage point, Rose could see several streets of wooden buildings, a church steeple, and scattered homesteads surrounding the town proper. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could make out the movement of people and horses along the main street. "It's larger than I expected," she admitted, feeling a sudden flutter of nervousness. "Grew fast the last few years," Preston explained. "The copper mine north of town brought in workers, and the railroad spur line made it easier to ship cattle. It's a decent town, as frontier towns go. Sheriff keeps order, and most folks are hardworking people just trying to make a life." As they descended toward Copper Creek, Rose found herself wishing their journey could last longer. The hours spent in Preston's company had been unexpectedly pleasant. There was something about his quiet strength and straightforward manner that made her feel secure in a way she hadn't since her father died. They rode down the main street of Copper Creek as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The town bustled with late-afternoon activity, shopkeepers sweeping porches, cowboys emerging from the saloon, women carrying baskets of shopping. Several people called greetings to Preston, who responded with nods and brief waves. "You're well known here," Rose observed. "I sell horses to many of the ranchers," Preston explained. "And I've lived in the area long enough to be considered local, though I don't come to town often." They stopped before a large two-story building with a sign that read Fairchild Boarding House in neat black letters. A wide porch wrapped around the front, furnished with several rocking chairs. Window boxes filled with spring flowers added a homey touch to the substantial structure. "Your aunt seems to be doing well for herself," Preston commented as he dismounted and came around to help Rose down from Willow. Before Rose could reply, the front door opened and a tall woman with silver-streaked auburn hair emerged onto the porch. She wore a practical dark blue dress with a white apron, and her hands were dusted with flour. "Can I help you folks?" she called, wiping her hands on her apron. Rose stepped forward, suddenly nervous. "Aunt Harriet, I'm Rose Fairchild, Margaret's daughter." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, then she hurried down the steps. "Rose, good heavens, child, we weren't expecting you for another week at least." She embraced Rose warmly, then held her at arm's length to study her face. "You have your mother's eyes. God rest her soul." Harriet Fairchild was a handsome woman in her late 40s, with the same green eyes Rose had inherited from her mother. There was strength in her face and kindness too, which eased some of Rose's anxiety about this new beginning. "I would have been here sooner," Rose explained, "but the stage was robbed near Las Vegas. I had to find another way north." Harriet's expression grew concerned. "Robbed? Were you harmed?" "No, just delayed and separated from most of my belongings," Rose assured her. "And then yesterday my horse collapsed just a few miles from town. If Mr. Nash hadn't come along when he did." She turned to include Preston in the conversation. Harriet's attention shifted to the quiet horseman standing respectfully to one side. "Preston Nash," she said with evident recognition. "So you're the knight in dusty leather who rescued my niece." Preston removed his hat, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the characterization. "Just happened to be passing by, Mrs. Fairchild. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Harriet contradicted with a knowing smile, And it's Miss Fairchild, though most folks just call me Harriet." She studied him for a moment. "You're the horse breeder from Eagle Creek, aren't you? I've heard good things about your stock." "Yes, madam," Preston confirmed. "I have a small place about 3 hours' ride east of here." "Well, you must stay for supper," Harriet declared. "It's the least we can do to thank you for bringing Rose safely to us." Preston shifted his weight, glancing at the sun's position. "That's kind, but I should start back if I want to make some distance before dark." "Nonsense," Harriet insisted. "It's too late to start a journey now. We have plenty of room. This is a boarding house. After all, and you can get a fresh start in the morning." She turned to Rose. "Your cousin Thomas can see to the horses." As if summoned by his name, a young man around 16 emerged from the barn behind the boarding house. He had Harriet's auburn hair and a friendly, open face. "Thomas, come meet your cousin Rose," Harriet called, "and take care of these horses, please." The boy approached with undisguised curiosity, wiping his hands on his trousers before offering one to Rose. "Pleased to meet you, Cousin Rose. Ma's been talking about your coming for weeks now." "It's lovely to meet you, Thomas," Rose replied, warming to his friendly manner immediately. After Thomas had led the horses away to be unsaddled and fed, Harriet ushered Rose and Preston into the boarding house. The interior was clean and well-maintained, with a large common room furnished with comfortable chairs and tables. A staircase led to the upper floor where Rose presumed the guest rooms were located. "You're just in time," Harriet said as she led them through to a large kitchen at the back of the house. "Supper's nearly ready, and we've got a full house tonight. 5 regular boarders plus 2 cattle buyers passing through." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking bread and something savory simmering on the large cook stove. A young woman with dark hair was setting a large table that could seat at least 12 people. "This is Lily," Harriet introduced. "She helps me with the cooking and cleaning." "Lily, this is my niece Rose and Mr. Nash, who escorted her safely to town." Lily smiled shyly. "Welcome to Copper Creek, Miss Fairchild. Please call me Rose," she replied, returning the smile. "Lily, show Rose to the blue room upstairs," Harriet instructed. "She can freshen up before supper. Mr. Nash, you can use the washroom off the kitchen if you'd like to clean up." As Rose followed Lily upstairs, she glanced back to see Preston standing somewhat awkwardly in the busy kitchen, hat in hand, looking decidedly out of place in the domestic setting. Their eyes met briefly, and Rose offered an encouraging smile before continuing up the stairs. The blue room was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. A window overlooked the main street of Copper Creek, now golden in the late afternoon light. "Your aunt fixed this room special for you," Lily explained as she poured fresh water into the washbowl. "Said it was to be yours alone, not for boarders." "That was kind of her," Rose said, touched by the thoughtfulness. "She's been excited about your coming," Lily confided. "Talks about her sister sometimes, your ma, I guess. Said they weren't close as they should have been, on account of your ma moving south with your pa." Rose nodded. Her mother had rarely mentioned her sister, though she'd kept a small photograph of them as young women. The resemblance between her mother and Aunt Harriet was strong enough to bring a lump to Rose's throat. After Lily left, Rose washed away the dust of travel and changed into her last clean blouse, a simple white cotton with embroidery at the collar. She brushed her hair and repinned it as neatly as she could with limited resources. When she descended to the kitchen, she found it transformed. The large table was now set with mismatched but clean dishes and cutlery, and several men had gathered, talking in the comfortable way of people accustomed to sharing meals. Preston stood slightly apart, freshly washed and with his dark hair neatly combed. He'd removed his gun belt, and without it, he looked less like a frontier horseman and more like a gentleman rancher. He glanced up as Rose entered, and something in his expression made her heartbeat quicken. "There you are," Harriet said, gesturing for Rose to join them. "Come meet everyone." The introductions passed in a blur. Mr. Johnson, the shopkeeper; Dr. Wilson, who served the town and surrounding ranches; Mr. Peterson, who worked at the bank; and two cattle buyers from Wyoming whose names Rose immediately forgot. All were polite, welcoming her to Copper Creek with genuine Western hospitality. During the meal, a hearty beef stew with fresh bread and early spring vegetables from Harriet's garden conversation flowed easily around the table. The cattle buyers discussed prices and conditions of the trails north. Dr. Wilson shared news of a new baby born at her ranch 10 miles outside town. Through it all, Rose was aware of Preston's quiet presence across the table, contributing occasionally but mostly observing. "Mr. Nash, I hear you've got some fine horses coming along this season," one of the cattle buyers said at one point. "My partner's looking for a good saddle horse that can handle mountain trails." Preston nodded. "I have several that might suit. 3-year-olds, well-trained but still fresh enough to have plenty of years ahead of them. Might swing by your place before heading back to Wyoming," the man said. "Heard good things about your stock." "You're welcome anytime," Preston replied. "Just follow the creek east from town. Can't miss the place." As the meal progressed, Rose learned more about Copper Creek and its inhabitants. The town had been founded just 15 years earlier when copper was discovered in the nearby hills. The mine still operated, though less profitably than in its heyday, and cattle ranching had become the area's primary business. Harriet had opened the boarding house 10 years ago after being widowed. "My husband was a mining engineer," she explained to Rose. "When the fever took him, I needed a way to support myself and Thomas. The town was growing with new people arriving weekly. A boarding house seemed the practical choice. After supper, most of the boarders retired to the common room or to their own quarters. Harriet, Rose, and Preston lingered at the table over coffee. "You've built something fine here, Miss Fairchild," Preston commented, looking around the well-ordered kitchen. "Thank you," Harriet replied. "It wasn't easy at first, but we've managed." She turned to Rose. "And now with you here, perhaps I can ease back a bit. These knees aren't what they used to be for climbing stairs and scrubbing floors." "I'm happy to help however I can," Rose assured her, though inwardly she wondered if running a boarding house was what she wanted for her future. She'd harbored girlhood dreams of adventure and perhaps teaching, like her mother had before marriage. As if reading her thoughts, Harriet added, "The town's growing enough that they're talking of building a proper schoolhouse. They've been making do with church space, but with more families settling, they'll need a dedicated teacher soon. I mentioned in my letter that you might be interested." Rose brightened at this news. "I would be. Mother made sure I had proper schooling, and I helped teach the younger children near our farm in New Mexico." "Well, nothing's settled yet," Harriet cautioned, "but it's a possibility for the future. Until then, I'd welcome your help here." The evening grew late, and Preston rose to take his leave. "I should turn in if I'm to get an early start tomorrow," he said. "I've had Thomas prepare the small room at the end of the hall for you," Harriet told him. "First door on the right at the top of the stairs." After Preston had gone upstairs, Harriet studied Rose's face with knowing eyes. "He seems a good man, that Preston Nash," she remarked casually as they cleared the last of the dishes. "He was very kind to help me," Rose replied, keeping her tone neutral despite the warmth she felt creeping into her cheeks. "Kind, yes," Harriet agreed. "And not hard to look at either if a woman notices such things." "Aunt Harriet," Rose exclaimed, embarrassed by the direct comment. Harriet laughed. I may be getting older, but I'm not blind, girl. I saw how your eyes followed him during supper, and has followed you just as often. Rose busied herself with drying a plate. We're practically strangers. We only met yesterday. Sometimes that's all it takes, Harriet said softly. I knew your uncle was the man for me within an hour of meeting him. Just felt right, like finding something I didn't know I was missing. Rose had no response to that, so she changed the subject, asking about the boarding house routine and what would be expected of her. Harriet allowed the diversion, but the knowing look in her eyes suggested the topic wasn't permanently closed. Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed in her new room, Rose found sleep elusive. Her mind kept returning to the events of the past 2 days, the fear when Willow collapsed, the relief when Preston appeared, the easy companionship they'd developed while repairing her saddle. Tomorrow he would ride back to his solitary cabin on Eagle Creek, and she would begin her new life here in Copper Creek. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. Morning arrived with the sounds of a household stirring to life, footsteps in the hallway, voices murmuring, the clatter of cookware in the kitchen below. Rose dressed quickly in her riding skirt and blouse, having nothing else clean to wear, and made her way downstairs. Harriet was already at work preparing breakfast with Lily's help. The smell of coffee, bacon, and biscuits filled the kitchen. "Good morning, dear," Harriet greeted her. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you," Rose replied, though in truth she had tossed and turned for hours before finally drifting off. "How can I help?" "You can set the table. 7 for breakfast this morning. The cattle buyers left at first light." As Rose arranged plates and cutlery, she glanced toward the stairs, wondering if Preston was still asleep. Her question was answered moments later when he appeared in the doorway, dressed for travel with his hat in his hands. "Good morning, ladies," he said, his voice carrying its usual calm assurance. "Something smells mighty fine." "Just in time for breakfast, Mr. Nash," Harriet said cheerfully. "Have a seat. It'll be ready directly." Preston sat at the table, nodding a greeting to Rose. "Sleep well, Miss Fairchild?" "Well enough," Rose repeated, suddenly finding the arrangement of forks fascinating. "And you, better than in my own bed," he admitted with a small smile. "Mrs. Fairchild runs a fine establishment." "Miss," Harriet corrected automatically as she brought a platter of bacon to the table. "And thank you. It's not fancy, but we aim for comfort." The other boarders filtered in, and breakfast proceeded with the same easy conversation as the previous night's supper. Through it all, Rose was acutely aware of Preston's presence, and the fact that he would soon be leaving when the meal concluded. Preston thanked Harriet for her hospitality and went to collect his saddlebags from upstairs. Rose followed him to the front porch, where Thomas had already brought his buckskin horse, saddled and ready to travel. "Your aunt seems like a good woman," Preston said as they stood on the porch. "You'll be in good hands here." "Yes," Rose agreed. "She's been very welcoming." An awkward silence fell between them. There seemed to be more to say, but neither could find the right words. "Well," Preston finally said, settling his hat on his head, "I should get going. Eagle Creek isn't getting any closer while I stand here." "Of course," Rose said quickly. "Thank you again for your help. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Preston regarded her steadily, something unreadable in his gray eyes. "It was my pleasure, Rose." The use of her given name sent a small thrill through her. He'd been so careful to call her Miss Fairchild throughout their journey. He turned to mount his horse, then paused and turned back. "The town has a social at the church every 3rd Saturday of the month, dancing and such. It's a good way to meet people." He cleared his throat. "I sometimes come in for it, when the weather's good." Rose couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. "Is that an invitation, Mr. Nash?" A faint color touched his cheekbones. "I suppose it is, if you're interested." "I might be," Rose replied, surprising herself with the boldness. "If the weather's good." Preston's serious face transformed with a smile. "Then I'll hope for clear skies." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, touched the brim of his hat in farewell, and turned toward the eastern road out of town. Rose watched him go, aware of Harriet coming to stand beside her on the porch. "Interesting man, that Preston Nash," her aunt commented. "Yes," Rose agreed softly. "He is." The following weeks established a rhythm to Rose's new life in Copper Creek. She quickly learned the routine of the boarding house: early mornings, preparing breakfast, cleaning rooms after the boarders left for their day's work, helping with laundry, shopping for supplies in the town's small but well-stocked general store, and assisting with the preparation of the evening meal. Harriet proved to be a fair employer and a loving aunt, giving Rose clear instructions, but also allowing her independence in completing tasks. Rose found she enjoyed the work more than she'd expected, particularly the interactions with the diverse boarders who passed through Harriet's establishment. In the evenings, after the kitchen was cleaned and the boarders settled in the common room or retired to their quarters, Rose and Harriet would often sit on the back porch with cups of tea, getting to know one another through shared stories. Rose learned about her mother's childhood, filling in gaps in her understanding of her family history. "Your mother was always the adventurous one," Harriet recalled one evening as they watched fireflies dance in the garden. "When your father came through our town in Pennsylvania with his tales of the West, Margaret was smitten not just with him, but with the idea of open spaces and new beginnings." "She never lost that," Rose said, smiling at the memory. Even after 20 years on the same farm, she'd still get excited about spring planting, like each year was a brand new adventure. "That was Margaret," Harriet agreed with a fond chuckle, always finding wonder in the ordinary. Rose also became acquainted with the town and its inhabitants. Copper Creek was a community in transition, still frontier enough to have its rough edges, but settled enough that families walked the streets without fear. Children attended the small school run by the church, and ladies gathered for sewing circles and socials. The town consisted of one main street with several cross streets, featuring a general store, a bank, a doctor's office, 2 saloons, one considerably rowdier than the other, a blacksmith, a small hotel, and various other businesses necessary for a growing community. Outside town, ranches of varying sizes spread across the valleys and foothills, while the copper mine that had given the town its name operated several miles to the north. As the days passed, Rose found her thoughts often turning to Preston Nash. She wondered what he was doing at his remote cabin, whether his horses were thriving, if he ever thought of her as she thought of him. She found herself watching the eastern road when she hung laundry or swept the front porch, half hoping to glimpse a rider on a buckskin horse. "He'll come," Harriet said one afternoon, catching Rose in one of these moments of road watching. "Who?" Rose asked innocently. Harriet's knowing look made pretense useless. "The church social is this Saturday," she reminded Rose. "He said he comes to town for those, didn't he?" "If the weather's good," Rose qualified, glancing at the clear blue sky. The May weather had been perfect: warm days and cool nights, with only occasional brief showers to nourish the flourishing countryside. Saturday arrived with Rose feeling unaccountably nervous. She had washed and pressed her best blouse and skirt, the only decent clothes she had until she could afford fabric to make more. Harriet, seeing her niece's limited wardrobe, had offered a blue ribbon from her own sewing basket to thread through Rose's braid. "It brings out your eyes," she said as Rose arranged her hair. "You look lovely, dear." The social was held in the churchyard, with tables of food arranged under the trees and lanterns hung to provide light as evening approached. Nearly everyone in town and from the surrounding ranches attended, making it a true community gathering. Children played games on the grass while adults clustered in conversational groups, catching up on news and gossip. Rose accompanied Harriet and Thomas, greeting people she'd met during her weeks in town, and being introduced to others she hadn't. Several young men asked her to join the dancing when the fiddlers began to play, and she accepted politely, though her eyes kept straying to the edges of the gathering, searching for a familiar figure. The sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink, when Rose finally spotted him. Preston stood at the edge of the churchyard, looking somewhat out of place in his clean but simple clothes among the townspeople in their Sunday best. He'd clearly made an effort, though his dark hair was neatly combed, his shirt was crisp, and he'd added a waistcoat she hadn't seen before. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Rose felt her heart quicken. Preston nodded in greeting, then made his way toward her, navigating through groups of chatting townsfolk. "Miss Fairchild," he said when he reached her, removing his hat. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Mr. Nash," she replied formally, aware of curious eyes watching their interaction. "Copper Creek seems to agree with me." "It does indeed," he agreed, his gray eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "I see you're becoming part of the community." Before Rose could respond, the fiddlers struck up a lively reel and couples began forming for a dance. Preston cleared his throat. "Would you care to dance, Miss Fairchild?" "I'd be delighted, Mr. Nash," Rose replied, placing her hand in his outstretched one. Preston proved to be a competent, if not particularly graceful dancer. He moved with the same quiet confidence he showed on horseback, never flashy but always sure. As they circled and turned with the other dancers, Rose found herself relaxing into the simple joy of movement and music. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted during a quieter moment in the dance. "I said I would," Preston replied simply. "Weather's good." The straightforward answer made Rose smile. Preston Nash was a man of his word, a rare enough quality in the world. When the dance ended, Preston suggested they get some refreshments. They filled plates with fried chicken, biscuits, and various salads and desserts contributed by the town's women, then found a quieter spot at the edge of the churchyard to sit and talk. "How is Willow doing?" Preston asked. "Has she recovered fully from her ordeal?" "Completely," Rose assured him. "Thomas has been exercising her daily. She's as spirited as ever. Good horse, that one, strong constitution." "And how are things at Eagle Creek?" Rose asked. "Your horse is doing well," Preston's expression softened with obvious pride. "Very well. Had 2 foals born since I saw you last. Fine-looking colts that should grow into excellent saddle horses." Their conversation flowed easily from horses to the doings in town, to Rose's adjustment to her new home. Preston listened intently as she described her work at the boarding house and her hopes for the teaching position when the town built its school. "You'd make a fine teacher," he said with quiet conviction. "You have the patience for it, and the intelligence." Rose felt herself blush at the straightforward compliment. "Thank you. I think I would enjoy it. I've always loved learning, and sharing knowledge with others seems a worthy calling." As the evening progressed, Rose became aware of curious glances directed their way. Apparently, Preston's presence at the social was unusual enough to attract attention, and his obvious interest in the newcomer to town had not gone unnoticed. "People are watching us," she murmured. Preston glanced around, unconcerned. "Small towns. Everyone knows everyone's business, or thinks they should." He looked back at her. "Does it bother you?" Rose considered the question. Not particularly. I just wasn't expecting to be the subject of gossip quite so soon. Being seen with the hermit horseman makes you interesting, Preston said with a wry smile. I don't come to these gatherings often. Why did you come tonight? Rose asked, then immediately wished she could retract the too direct question. Preston's gray eyes met hers steadily. I think you know why, Rose. The simple honesty of his response left her momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a reply, they were interrupted by Thomas, who approached with barely contained excitement. Mr. Nash, Mr. Jenkins is looking for you. Says he wants to talk about buying one of your horses for his son. Preston nodded, though Rose thought she detected a flicker of regret at the interruption. Thank you, Thomas. I should speak with him. He turned to Rose. Will you excuse me? This could be important business. Of course, Rose replied, understanding the practical necessity. I should check if Aunt Harriet needs help with anything anyway. As Preston walked away with Thomas, Harriet appeared at Rose's side as if conjured by mention of her name. Well, well, she said, her eyes twinkling. I see the weather was good enough for Mr. Nash to make the ride into town. He mentioned he had business here, Rose said primly, though she couldn't suppress a smile. Harriet hummed skeptically. Business that just happened to coincide with the social. And with the prettiest young woman in Copper Creek being in attendance. Aunt Harriet, Rose protested, though she was secretly pleased by both the compliment and the implication. The evening continued pleasantly, with more dancing and socializing. Preston returned after his business discussion and asked Rose for another dance. As they moved together to a slower tune, Rose was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him, the respectful distance he maintained between them, even as the dance brought them close. When the music ended and the gathering began to disperse, Preston walked Rose, Harriet, and Thomas back to the boarding house. Will you be staying in town tonight, Mr. Nash? Harriet asked as they reached the front porch. No, madam, Preston replied. I need to get back to the ranch. Have animals that need tending early. Surely they can wait until morning, Harriet pressed. It's nearly dark. We have a room available. Preston shook his head. Thank you, but I know the trail well enough. Moon's nearly full, plenty of light to see by. Rose felt a stab of disappointment, but understood his responsibility to his animals. A man who made his living from horses couldn't neglect them, even for a pleasant evening in town. When will you be coming to town again? She asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Soon, Preston promised. I need to bring some horses in for the blacksmith to shoe, perhaps next week. You're welcome to take dinner with us when you do, Harriet offered. We always have plenty. That's kind of you, Miss Fairchild, Preston said. I'd be honored. After Harriet and Thomas went inside, Preston lingered a moment on the porch with Rose. I enjoyed this evening, he said quietly. As did I, Rose replied. Thank you for the dances. Preston studied her face in the soft light spilling from the windows. Rose, I'm not much for pretty words or grand gestures, but I'd like to see you again, if that would be acceptable. The directness of his statement, delivered with such earnest simplicity, touched Rose deeply. It would be more than acceptable, Preston, she answered, using his given name deliberately. It would be very welcome. The smile that transformed his serious features made her heart skip. He took her hand and with old-fashioned formality raised it briefly to his lips. Good night, Rose, he said. Until next week. Good night, she replied, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering darkness, his figure gradually blending with the night until he disappeared from view. Inside, Harriet was waiting in the kitchen with 2 cups of tea. Well, she asked as Rose sat down across from her. Rose couldn't contain her smile. He's coming back next week. Of course he is, Harriet said with satisfaction. "That man looks at you the way a thirsty man eyes a cool spring. He'll be back as often as he can find reason to come to town." As the days passed, Rose found herself watching for Preston with increasing anticipation. True to his word, he returned the following week, bringing 3 horses to be shod by the town blacksmith. He took dinner at the boarding house and afterward walked with Rose along the main street of Copper Creek, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. It became a pattern over the following weeks. Preston would find reasons to come to town: horses that needed shoeing, supplies to purchase, potential buyers to meet, and each visit included time spent with Rose. Sometimes they simply walked and talked. Other times he would help with tasks around the boarding house, demonstrating a surprising handiness with tools. On one memorable occasion in early June, Preston arrived with a surprise: a bolt of pretty blue cotton fabric and a packet of sewing notions. "I remembered you mentioning you had few clothes since the stage robbery," he explained somewhat awkwardly as he presented the gifts. "Thought you might be able to make use of these." Rose was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you, Preston. This is exactly what I needed." With Harriet's help and her own considerable sewing skills, Rose soon fashioned the fabric into 2 new dresses, one practical for everyday wear and one slightly more formal for church and social occasions. The first time she wore the nicer dress to church, Preston's appreciative glance told her more than words could have about how he found her appearance. June blossomed into July, bringing with it hot days and the occasional spectacular thunderstorm. Copper Creek bustled with summer activity: ranchers driving cattle to summer pastures, miners working longer hours in the cooler mornings and evenings, merchants doing brisk business with travelers passing through. Rose settled more deeply into her life at the boarding house, taking increasing responsibility as Harriet gratefully stepped back from some of the more physically demanding tasks. Rose's natural organization and efficiency made her an asset, and she found satisfaction in creating a welcoming environment for the boarders and visitors who passed through. She also began helping at the church school 2 mornings a week, giving the overtaxed preacher's wife a much-needed respite from teaching the town's children. Word of Rose's effective teaching methods spread, strengthening the community's interest in building a dedicated schoolhouse and hiring her as the teacher. Through it all, her relationship with Preston deepened and evolved. Their conversations grew more personal, touching on hopes and fears, past experiences, and tentative dreams for the future. Preston spoke of his ambition to expand his horse breeding operation, while Rose shared her desire to establish a proper school where children could receive an education, regardless of their circumstances. During a particularly beautiful sunset in mid-July, Preston took Rose for a ride outside town to a hillside overlooking the valley. They sat on a fallen log, watching the sky transform into a canvas of gold, crimson, and purple. "I used to come here when I first settled in this area," Preston said, his voice soft with memory. "Whenever I felt lost or uncertain, this view would remind me why I chose this place." "It's breathtaking," Rose agreed, watching as the colors deepened and shifted. "Rose," Preston said after a comfortable silence, "I've been meaning to ask you something." The seriousness in his tone made her turn to look at him. "Yes. There's a horse auction in Helena next month. Best stock from all over the territory will be there. I'm taking some of my yearlings to sell." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I wondered if you might consider accompanying me. Your aunt and Thomas would be welcome too, of course." Rose was surprised by the invitation. Helena was a considerable journey, at least 3 days' travel each way. You want me to attend a horse auction with you? Preston smiled slightly. The auction is my business, yes. But Helena is a fine city with theaters, restaurants, proper shops. I thought you might enjoy seeing it. And he hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. I thought it might be a good opportunity for us to spend more time together, away from the curious eyes of Copper Creek. The implication was clear. This would be a significant step in their relationship, a public acknowledgement of their growing attachment to each other. I'd like that very much, Rose said softly. I'll speak with Aunt Harriet about it. The brilliant smile that transformed Preston's normally serious face was reward enough for her answer. Impulsively, he reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. When Harriet heard of Preston's invitation, she responded with knowing satisfaction. It's about time, she declared. That man has been courting you as carefully as someone approaching a nervous colt. Helena, is it? Well, that's a proper step. Then you approve? Rose asked, though her aunt's attitude made the question almost unnecessary. Of course I approve. Preston Nash is a good man, honest, hardworking, and clearly smitten with you. Harriet's expression softened. More importantly, I've seen how you light up when he's around. You deserve happiness, Rose, especially after all you've been through. What about the boarding house? Rose asked. Can you manage without me for nearly 2 weeks? Harriet waved a dismissive hand. Lily is becoming quite capable, and I managed for years before you arrived. We'll be fine. Her eyes twinkled. Though I think I'll decline the invitation to accompany you. Thomas has plans to help with the roundup at the Miller Ranch, and someone needs to mind the business. Rose suspected her aunt's decision had more to do with giving her and Preston time alone together than any pressing business needs, but she didn't argue the point. Thomas could still come with us, Rose suggested, mindful of propriety. Nonsense, Harriet replied briskly. Preston is as honorable as they come, and you're a sensible woman. You'll travel with others on the stage, stay in respectable accommodations, and behave with perfect propriety, I'm sure. The gossips will talk regardless of what you do, so you might as well enjoy yourself. The weeks leading up to the Helena trip passed quickly, filled with preparation. Rose completed her new dresses, adding details and trimmings to make them suitable for a city visit. Preston made arrangements for the transportation of his horses and secured passages on the stagecoach that would take them to Helena ahead of his stock. The morning of their departure arrived clear and warm. Preston appeared at the boarding house just after dawn, dressed in his best clothes and looking uncharacteristically nervous. Ready for an adventure? He asked, as he helped load Rose's small trunk onto the stagecoach. More than ready, she replied, her excitement evident in her bright eyes and smile. The journey to Helena was long but not unpleasant. The stagecoach carried 6 passengers, Rose and Preston, an elderly couple returning to their daughter's home in Helena, and 2 businessmen traveling to the territorial capital on banking matters. Conversation flowed easily among the group, making the hours pass more quickly. They stopped at way stations for meals and to change horses, spending 2 nights in rustic but clean accommodations along the route. Throughout the journey, Preston was attentive and considerate, ensuring Rose's comfort without being overbearing. By the time they reached Helena on the 3rd day, Rose felt as though their relationship had deepened simply through the shared experience of travel. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable understanding that needed few words. Helena itself was a revelation to Rose. Though she'd grown up in the New Mexico territory and was no stranger to frontier settlements, The territorial capital was far more developed than she had imagined. Substantial buildings lined the streets, many constructed of brick rather than rough-hewn timber. There were proper restaurants, hotels, theaters, and shops offering goods from as far away as New York and San Francisco. Preston had reserved rooms for them at a respectable hotel near the center of town. After they had settled in and refreshed themselves from the journey, he suggested dinner at a restaurant he knew from previous visits. "We should celebrate our arrival," he said, offering his arm as they left the hotel. The restaurant was elegant by Western standards, with white tablecloths, polished silverware, and a menu that featured dishes Rose hadn't tasted since leaving the East as a child. Over a meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh vegetables, they discussed their plans for the coming days. "The auction begins the day after tomorrow," Preston explained. "I'll need to check on my horses when they arrive tomorrow and make sure they're presented properly. But that shouldn't take all day. I thought perhaps you'd enjoy visiting some of the shops." "I'd like that," Rose agreed. "And I'd be interested in seeing your horses too, if that wouldn't be an imposition." Preston looked pleased by her interest. "Not an imposition at all. I'd be proud to show them to you." The following day, they visited the auction grounds where Preston's horses would be sold. The young animals, 3 colts and 2 fillies, had traveled well and seemed to be in excellent condition. Rose watched as Preston checked each one carefully, speaking to them in low, soothing tones as he examined their legs and hooves. "They're beautiful," Rose commented truthfully. The yearlings showed the careful breeding that was Preston's specialty: strong limbs, deep chests, intelligent eyes, and balanced conformation. "Thank you," Preston replied, his pride evident. "This gray colt in particular, I have high hopes for him. His sire was one of the best cutting horses I've ever seen, and his dam has passed her stamina to all her offspring." Rose found Preston's knowledge and obvious care for his animals deeply appealing. Here was a man who took pride in doing things properly, who understood that successful horse breeding required both science and art. After ensuring his horses were properly settled, Preston accompanied Rose to Helena's shopping district. They visited a bookstore where Rose selected several volumes for her teaching work, a dry goods emporium where she purchased small gifts for Harriet and Thomas, and a millinery shop where Preston insisted on buying her a pretty bonnet trimmed with blue ribbons that matched her eyes. "You shouldn't spend your money on me," Rose protested, though she was touched by the gesture. "It's not often I have the opportunity to buy something beautiful for someone special," Preston replied simply, his candor silencing her objections. The auction began the next morning, drawing horse buyers and sellers from across Montana territory and beyond. Preston's horses were scheduled to be presented in the afternoon, so he and Rose spent the morning observing other sales and noting the prices different animals commanded. When Preston's yearlings entered the ring, Rose found herself unexpectedly nervous on his behalf. She knew how much work and care he had invested in these animals, how important their sale was to the success of his breeding program. Her concern proved unnecessary. Preston's reputation for quality stock preceded him, and the bidding was spirited. By the end of the session, all 5 yearlings had sold for excellent prices, with the gray colt fetching nearly twice what Preston had hoped. "Congratulations," Rose said as they left the auction grounds, Preston's expression a mixture of satisfaction and something almost like melancholy. "You must be pleased with the results." "I am," he confirmed, though his eyes lingered on the gray colt being led away by its new owner. "Always a bit hard to see them go, though. Raised them from birth, watched them grow. But that's the business: breed them, train them, sell them to someone who'll appreciate their quality." Rose squeezed his arm gently, understanding his mixed emotions. "You've built something to be proud of, Preston. Everyone at the auction respected your horses and your work." That evening, flush with his success at the auction, Preston took Rose to Helena's finest restaurant, insisting they had cause for celebration. The establishment was more elegant than any Rose had visited before, with crystal glassware, fine china, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. "This is too extravagant," Rose whispered as they were seated at a table with a view of the musicians. "Perhaps," Preston agreed with a rare smile. "But sometimes life should be celebrated properly, and I have much to celebrate tonight." He ordered champagne, another first for Rose, who found the bubbling wine delightful if a bit overwhelming. Over a sumptuous meal, they talked of the auction, of Preston's plans for his breeding program, of Rose's hopes for the Copper Creek School. As the evening progressed, Preston's manner became slightly more serious, even nervous. He seemed to be working towards saying something important, choosing and discarding words in his mind. "Rose," he finally said during a pause in their conversation, "these past months since I found you on the trail with your injured horse, they've been the best of my life." The simple sincerity of his statement touched Rose deeply. "They've been wonderful for me too," she replied softly. Preston reached across the table to take her hand. "I've lived alone for a long time, thought that was how it would always be, but now—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Now I can't imagine going back to that solitary life, not without you in it." Rose felt her heart quicken, sensing the direction of his words. "I'm not a wealthy man," Preston continued, "though today's auction has certainly helped my situation. I have a simple home and a business that demands hard work and long hours, but I can offer you honesty, respect, and a love that grows stronger every day we're together." His gray eyes held her steadily. "Rose Fairchild, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to anticipate this moment, the actual question still left Rose momentarily speechless. Looking into Preston's earnest face, she saw everything she'd come to value in him: his integrity, his quiet strength, his capacity for tenderness beneath his reserved exterior. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Yes, Preston Nash, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his features was something Rose knew she would remember all her days. Preston raised her hand to his lips, then reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. "I bought this yesterday," he admitted, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a small sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Hoped I wouldn't have to return it." "It's beautiful," Rose whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. The ring fit perfectly, the blue stone catching the light like a captured star. For the remainder of their time in Helena, Rose felt as though she were walking in a dream. They visited the territorial offices to inquire about the requirements for marriage, deciding they would wed in Copper Creek with Harriet and their friends in attendance. They spent hours walking through the city parks, planning their future together. Preston would enlarge his cabin, adding rooms to make it more suitable for family life. Rose would continue to help Harriet until the school was established, then divide her time between teaching and assisting with the horse breeding business. They spoke of children they hoped to have, of the life they would build together on the small ranch beside Eagle Creek. The journey back to Copper Creek seemed shorter somehow, their happiness making the hours pass quickly. When they arrived, Harriet took one look at them standing together on her porch and broke into a wide smile. "Well," she demanded, her eyes going to Rose's hand where the sapphire ring caught the afternoon light. "We're to be married," Rose confirmed, unable to contain her happiness. "With your blessing," Aunt Harriet. "Of course you have it," Harriet declared, embracing her niece and then, to his evident surprise, Preston as well. "Nothing could please me more than seeing you both so happy." The news spread quickly through the small community, generating genuine congratulations from most quarters. There were a few raised eyebrows at the relatively brief courtship, and one or two young men who had harbored hopes regarding the pretty newcomer expressed disappointment. But overall, the reaction was positive. The weeks that followed were busy ones. Preston set to work expanding his cabin, adding 2 new rooms and improving the existing structure. Several of his neighbors, including some whose horses he had trained, came to help with the construction, turning the project into a community effort that progressed rapidly. Rose divided her time between her duties at the boarding house, her teaching at the church school, and preparations for her new life. She sewed household linens, packed her few belongings, and made several visits to Eagle Creek to help plan the layout of her future home. The wedding was set for early September, when the summer heat would be waning but before the first snows of winter. They would be married in the Copper Creek Church with Reverend Michaels officiating, followed by a celebration at the boarding house. As the date approached, Rose found herself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, her horse collapsing on the trail, Preston happening to pass by at just the right moment. What if Willow had faltered an hour earlier or later? What if Preston had taken a different route that day? The series of chances that had led to their meeting seemed both random and somehow destined. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with a hint of autumn crispness in the air that promised the change of seasons. Rose dressed in her room at the boarding house, wearing a new gown of ivory silk that Harriet had insisted on ordering from Helena as a wedding gift. "You look beautiful," Harriet said, arranging the simple veil over Rose's carefully styled hair. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Rose blinked back tears at the mention of her mother. "I wish she could be here," she said softly. "Father, too." "They are here in spirit," Harriet assured her, touching the locket around Rose's neck that contained miniature portraits of her parents. "And they would approve of the man you've chosen. Preston Nash is 1 in 1,000 the kind who keeps his promises and puts honor above convenience." The small church was filled to capacity with the citizens of Copper Creek and ranchers from the surrounding area. Preston stood at the altar, looking uncharacteristically nervous in his new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his gray eyes searching the doorway until Rose appeared on Thomas's arm. The simple ceremony joined their lives with traditional vows, and the exchange of rings, Rose's sapphire engagement ring joined by a plain gold band for her, and a matching one for Preston. When Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife, Preston's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, bringing applause from the assembled guests. The celebration at the boarding house lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, food prepared by Harriet and the women of the church, and enough well wishes to last a lifetime. As twilight deepened into night, Preston and Rose took their leave, departing in a wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers by the local children. "Are you ready, Mrs. Nash?" Preston asked as he helped her into the wagon seat. The new name sent a thrill through Rose. "Yes, Mr. Nash," she replied with a smile. "I'm ready for our adventure to begin." The 3-hour journey to Eagle Creek passed in comfortable conversation and occasional companionable silences. When they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, Rose felt a surge of emotion at the sight of what was now her home. Preston had transformed the simple structure. The original cabin remained at the core, but he had added a proper bedroom wing and expanded the main living area. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides, furnished with chairs made by a craftsman in Copper Creek. Lanterns had been lit and hung from the porch posts, welcoming them home with golden light. "It's beautiful," Rose said as Preston helped her down from the wagon. "Wait until you see inside," he replied, lifting her into his arms before she could respond. "Threshold tradition," he explained with a rare grin as he carried her up the steps and through the front door. The interior had been just as thoughtfully prepared. New curtains hung at the windows, a colorful rug covered the main room's floor, and a vase of wildflowers stood on the table. A fire had been laid in the stove, ready to be lit against the evening chill. "Thomas rode out this morning to get everything ready," Preston explained, setting Rose gently on her feet. "Wanted it to be welcoming for you." Rose turned slowly, taking in what was now her home. It was still a simple frontier dwelling, but Preston had added touches of comfort and beauty wherever possible. The bookshelf had been expanded to accommodate her books alongside his. A new rocking chair sat near the stove, positioned to catch the warmth in winter evenings. In the corner, she spotted a small desk where she could write letters or prepare lessons. "You've thought of everything," she said, deeply touched by the effort he had made to make the cabin a home for both of them. "I wanted it to be worthy of you," Preston replied, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "It's not fancy like some of the houses in Helena." Rose silenced his concerns with a kiss. "It's perfect," she assured him. "Absolutely perfect." Later that night, as they lay together in the new bedroom Preston had built with his own hands, Rose listened to the sound of her husband's steady breathing and the distant chorus of night creatures outside. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the grief of losing her parents, the uncertainty of traveling to an unknown future, the fear when her horse collapsed on the lonely trail. All of it had led to this moment, this new beginning with a man whose quiet strength and integrity had won her heart. "Are you still awake?" Preston's voice came softly in the darkness. "Yes," she whispered back. His arm tightened around her waist, drawing her closer. "I was just thinking about the day we met. If Willow hadn't faltered just when she did, if I'd taken a different route that afternoon." Rose smiled in the darkness, amused that his thoughts had paralleled her own. "Perhaps it wasn't chance at all," she suggested. "Perhaps it was exactly what was meant to be." Preston was silent for a moment, considering. "I've never been much for believing in fate," he finally said. "Always figured a man makes his own way through hard work and determination." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "But finding you there on that trail, just when you needed help most, makes me wonder if sometimes life has plans we don't understand." "Whether it was fate or fortune," Rose replied, turning in his arms to face him, "I'm grateful it brought us together." The years that followed proved the wisdom of their union. Preston's horse breeding business flourished under their combined efforts, his practical knowledge of horses complemented by Rose's organizational skills and eye for marketing opportunities. They expanded the operation gradually, adding more brood mares and acquiring a new stallion whose bloodlines brought fresh qualities to their stock. Rose did indeed become the teacher at Copper Creek's new schoolhouse, dividing her time between educating the community's children and helping with the ranch. The arrangement worked well, allowing her to fulfill both her professional aspirations and her commitment to building their home and business. Harriet continued to run the boarding house successfully, though she gradually turned more responsibility over to Lily, who proved to have a talent for management. Thomas, as he matured, discovered an aptitude for ranching and eventually took a position with one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, though he visited his mother and cousin frequently. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Rose gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after Preston's father. The boy inherited his father's serious demeanor and his mother's curious intelligence, growing into a thoughtful child who loved books almost as much as he loved horses. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family. They named her Margaret after Rose's mother, but called her Maggie. She was a spirited child from the beginning, with her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's chestnut hair, determined to keep up with her older brother in all things. Life on the frontier was never easy. There were harsh winters when snow piled high around the cabin, and worry about the horses kept them awake at night. There were dry summers when water became precious and fire a constant threat. There were illnesses, accidents, and the 1,000 natural challenges of carving a life from the wilderness. But there were countless joys as well, watching their children grow strong and capable in the clean Montana air, seeing their hard work rewarded as the reputation of Nash horses spread throughout the territory and beyond, gathering with neighbors for barn raisings and harvests, celebrating holidays and milestones with Harriet and their expanding circle of friends in Copper Creek. 10 years after their wedding, on an autumn evening much like the one when they had first met, Preston and Rose sat on their porch watching their children play with Scout's latest puppies in the yard. The cabin had expanded again over the years, with additional rooms added as their family and prosperity grew. The stables were larger now, housing nearly 30 horses of various ages, and a proper barn stood where once there had been only a simple shelter. "Would you look at that sunset?" Preston remarked, his arm around Rose's shoulders as they sat together on the porch swing he had built for their 5th anniversary. The western sky blazed with color gold and crimson, and purple painting the clouds in a spectacular display that reflected in the waters of Eagle Creek. "Reminds me of the evening we met," Rose said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "When Willow collapsed and you appeared like some frontier guardian angel." Preston chuckled at the characterization. "Not much of an angel, just a man who couldn't pass by someone in trouble." "My hero nonetheless," Rose insisted with a smile. "You mended my saddle and said trust me, and I did, though every sensible instinct warned against trusting a stranger." "Best decision you ever made," Preston teased, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Second best," Rose corrected. "Marrying you was the best." As they watched their children's laughter and the dying glory of another Montana day, Rose reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter on a lonely trail to this rich, full life they had built together, it seemed both miraculous and somehow inevitable, as though their paths could not have unfolded any other way. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Preston asked, noting her contemplative expression. "About broken horses and mended saddles," Rose replied with a smile. "And about how sometimes what seems like misfortune is actually the beginning of something wonderful." Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders, his gray eyes warm with understanding and love accumulated through years of shared joys and challenges. "I'd say that's true enough," he agreed, watching as James showed Maggie how to properly approach one of the puppies. "Though I hope our children have an easier road than we did." "Not too easy," Rose cautioned. "It's the challenges that reveal our true strength, after all." Preston nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. "Like a good horse showing its quality when the trail gets rough." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Preston called the children in for supper. Rose watched them race toward the house, their faces alight with the simple joy of childhood, and felt a profound gratitude for this life they had created together. Later that night, with the children asleep and the cabin quiet save for the ticking of the clock Preston had ordered from St. Louis for their anniversary, Rose found herself standing at the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of their ranch. Preston came to stand beside her, following her gaze across the silver-washed pastures where their horses grazed peacefully. "No regrets?" he asked quietly, the question carrying the weight of their shared history. Rose turned to him, seeing in his beloved face the same steady strength and quiet integrity that had drawn her to him from the beginning, now enriched by the patina of their years together. "Not one," she assured him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Every step of the journey brought us here, exactly where we were meant to be." Preston gathered her close, and as they stood together in the moonlight, Rose knew with absolute certainty that the broken horse at Dusk had been not an ending but a beginning, the first chapter in a love story still unfolding beneath the vast Montana sky.